to session 7 of the Southeast Asia Energy Transition Roundtable. And before today's session, I'd like to introduce you the background that I'm having here. You see the lake, that's a Burley Griffin Lake, the signature landmark of Canberra, the capital of Australia, where Australian National University is based. And I wanted to show you and tell you what it is, because you might be wondering what's going on in the background. Actually, that's the background. I'm in my office now, but I took the picture and put it in the background of Zoom. So remind me that the nature is just behind and beside us. Hi everyone again. In today's session, we are gonna learn about another interesting topic, the energy efficiency. But before the official session, I would like to have some reminders. First, if you haven't done so, please go to the course website and upload the employer's support letter. That would counter what the requirement for issuing the certificate of participation. Some of you have done, but if you haven't, please do so. Second, please come to the sessions regularly, because we are checking your attendance. And again, that's another requirement for having this certificate of participation. And needless to say, all the sessions are interesting, at least in my view, and I'm sure that you will find elements that relevant to your work and your interests. So yeah, do arrange the time to come regularly. Today's session, energy efficiency. Now we all know that energy demand is increasing fast, especially in our countries, Indonesia, Philippines, and Vietnam, around 10% per year. To meet the increasing demand, we need to look at both supply and demand side, right? And we've been discussing a lot so far on the supply side, how to generate more energy, especially how to generate clean renewable energies. And we know that there are a lot of issues associated with that. Today, we will discuss from demand side, how to manage the energy demand efficiently and wisely, so that we can meet the demand as well as facilitate the transition to renewable energy, which takes time. Right? So if we don't pay enough attention to energy efficiency, then it would not be easy for us to transit towards the renewable energy. With that in mind, I would like to introduce Dr. Lee White. She's a research fellow here at the ANU, and she has done a lot of research on energy efficiency, energy demand in Asia. And welcome, Dr. Lee White, and welcome everyone to today's session. Today we will have Tarek Katesen from MPAS to facilitate, and you all know him well already, so no need more introduction. So now I'd like to hand over to Lee for starting the official session, please.
Thanks, Tom. I'll just get my slides shared here. It's nice to meet everyone. I'm Dr. Lee White at the Australian National University, a research fellow at the School of Regulation and Global Governance, and also at the Grand Challenge for Zero Carbon Energy in the Asia Pacific. But just to check that those slides are showing up okay for everyone. Looks like they are. Great.
Yeah, good.
Thanks. And also to mention that very happy for us to have I hope we have a lot of discussion in the Q&A sections. I've put placeholders throughout the presentation slides for us to pause and have discussions, have Q&A. These are phrased as prompts for you to think about things that I've been discussing in the context of your own policy and share with me and others about them. But please feel free to also ask questions that have come up during listening to the lecture at those points. So this session will be looking at aspects of understanding key technologies that enable transition to zero emissions energy systems, and also considering the market regulatory and policy frameworks that can help underpin this transition. And specifically, we'll be looking at energy efficiency. And so this is really about how you can achieve the same thing by using less energy. So for example, if you have a more energy efficient building that has more insulation, that has double glazing, you can keep that building at a comfortable temperature. You can keep it warm in winter or cool in summer, using less energy than you would need to use to keep a less efficient building at that same temperature. Likewise, if you have a more efficiently designed fridge, also, sort of better insulation, a more efficient motor, you can achieve the same outcome of keeping your food cool, again, by using less energy. And sometimes when energy efficiency is discussed, it's also covering behavioral changes. So you'll see recommendations such as you should be doing your laundry with cold water, or setting back your thermostat, which is, say, for example, if you've been keeping it at 22 degrees Celsius in winter, you should drop it down to 20 degrees Celsius in winter. And I did sort of want to note that some of these behavioral changes may not seem as relevant for some people and places. Often some of these recommendations can come out of places like the EU, where people might be doing their laundry with hot water very often, or keeping the room very warm in winter. But even in places like Australia, it can be less relevant. I don't think there's quite as much room sometimes for people to set their thermostats back while still achieving comfort, as some recommendations you'll see might indicate. And just to sort of get an idea, I'm going to launch a Zoom quiz. Oops, I had the button for it. There it is. And if you can just put in, this is a question about the kinds of strategies that your country currently has for energy efficiency. So we'll go through all of these in the lecture in more detail, but some categories of policies are information, like labels to rate energy efficiency, financial support, like rebates or subsidies to homes or businesses for energy improvements, or rules for minimum requirements on energy efficiency. So those are the three options. You can choose as many as you like. I see we've got about half of the class has answered so far, so we'll give it a little bit longer. Two-thirds. I think I'll probably end the poll when we get to about three-quarters, or a long pause. Okay, so we've got about 70% have answered there, so we'll continue. You should be able to see the results of that on the screen there. And so it looks like the most common policy or strategy that's already in use is labeling of energy efficiency. And this sort of makes sense because this is one of the, I guess, cheaper options to implement. It can act as a baseline for a lot of these other measures. And so that distribution of, a lot of places do have these labels, and fewer of them are offering that financial support or rules with minimum energy efficiency requirements. So that's good to know going through the lecture. I think you'll probably have some familiarity with some of the things I'm talking about, but hopefully it also provides a bit of additional context, including some international insights. So just as a bit of an overview, these are some of the diagrams from the IPCC report, which tend to be very information dense. But I did just want to highlight that they have also flagged the role of energy efficiency and demand side strategies as being really key for climate change mitigation. So a demand side strategy is when you're changing the use of energy rather than changing the supply of energy. So energy efficiency is one of those strategies that affects the demand. And so if by 2050, if there are very comprehensive, very far-reaching demand-side strategies across all sectors, that could reduce emissions globally by 40 to 70, that's very large, 40 to 70% compared to projections of current scenarios. And so they have flagged several of these areas, like the energy efficiency of building envelopes and appliances. And so that's a fairly large chunk there. And they've also flagged social practices relating to lifestyle, which I talked a bit about earlier. And this is something that comes up for industry as well. And again, that's sort of fairly large chunk there associated with these measures. And one of the other things that is viewed as beneficial for these energy efficiency measures is that they can be cheaper than the scenario where you don't implement them. So this is again from the IPCC report, the most recent one. The bars that are blue are where costs are lower than they would be otherwise. So you can see that avoiding demand for energy services, that's the things like, well, don't make the room as warm in winter, or maybe you don't make the room as cool in summer, and don't do as much of the laundry in hot water. Avoiding demand can save money as well as reducing carbon emissions, and also using more efficient products, so more efficient lighting, more efficient appliances like that more efficient fridge. It can be cheaper over the life cycle of the product, so the whole time that it's owned. If you're using less energy every day to achieve the same thing, that can be cost effective. But things like new buildings with high energy performance, you can save a lot of energy and reduce emissions a lot that way, but they're also very expensive to make those buildings. And in particular, I think it's worth noting that when you have an existing building and you want to replace it with a more efficient building, the old building still works. It's using more energy than it needs to, but it is expensive in terms of both money and in terms of emissions to replace an existing building with a more efficient one. So in terms of energy efficiency improvements, existing building stock remains a challenge globally to get those upgrades effectively in place. And in industry as well, energy efficiency is sort of coming in at the at the low end cost-wise there. It can be a pretty low cost way to reduce emissions. So sort of zooming out again a little bit, when we're talking about energy use, it's generally a means to an end, not an end in itself. So we're using energy because of what it can do for us. It can provide services such as keeping the room warm, keeping the room well lit, keeping the room cool. You use it when you're doing things like cleaning clothes, cleaning dishes. And so you need all of those things from energy. But the amount of energy that you use to do them, if you have a more energy efficient process, you can achieve that same thing using less energy. And energy, access to these energy services like lighting and cooling, are generally considered essential to being able to lead a good life. And so in terms of energy efficiency measures that can make it more affordable and more accessible, for example, to be able to achieve these things, to access these energy services, energy efficiency measures are something that can have benefits not just for climate, but also for increasing affordability of access to energy services. And so they can be beneficial in a variety of ways. Again, this is the last IPCC graphic. They've compared various areas for energy efficiency across the Sustainable Development Goals. So just to highlight there, for example, there's synergies whereby addressing these all of these energy efficiency areas and buildings, you're also making progress towards affordable and clean energy and towards sustainable cities and communities, responsible consumption and production, and a lot of these other areas. So it's a case where you can achieve two things at once. They've also flagged areas where things are going in both directions. There's not a lot of negatives, which would be where their goals are working at cross purposes. And with industry also, many of those same areas, energy efficiency can also address some of these sustainable development goals. And so we'll pause there for the first of the Q&A breaks. It'd be good to hear. Yeah, so the questions on the slide about current areas of focus in your country and your thoughts on the sustainable development goal synergies there. And happy to take questions that are unrelated to that prompt also.
Great, thanks a lot, Lee. So please, if you've got your own question, ask it. But I think these are two quite interesting questions here for the three countries, and it would be also interesting to see how much energy efficiency is featuring in the energy discussions in your country. So is it an area of focus? Anybody wish to raise their hand and give us some thoughts about energy efficiency in your country? Okay. Maybe this is, we can, oh, good, we have one hand raised. Miss Lan from Vietnam. Can somebody please unmute Miss Lan's microphone?
Yes, yes, I'm Lan. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I will. Who's this one? Yes. Okay, so for the energy efficiency in Vietnam, I think that is a main focus of Vietnam in terms of long-term energy strategy also. And we now have many I mean the program relevant to energy efficiency in industry sector. Yeah, and because it's the sector that consume a lot of energy and also emits a lot of greenhouse gas as well, and Vietnam also have I mean that the aim to reduce the greenhouse gas emission to get the target of net zero in 2050, and because of that, we try to increase the energy efficiency in industry as well. And maybe the number is not exactly, but I think that we try to increase efficiency by 5 to 7%. Yeah, compared to the base case in the next 2 decades. Yes, that's a general information that from Vietnam side. So if you other participants, if you want to discuss with me in this energy efficiency area, and we can have contact later after yes, at the course, because I don't want to say for a long conversation right now. Yes, and let the time the room for other participants. Yeah.
Thanks, Miss Lan. Oh, sorry, Lee.
I was saying the same thing, which is a thank you. I'll assume that's your role.
Yeah, so it's in Vietnam, we see energy efficiency is something that's directly linked to the net zero targets. It's focusing first on industrial electricity consumption, and there's a target of maybe around, let's say, 5-7% in the next coming decades. We have also one more comment from Sari Murdiati. Could somebody unmute Sari's mic, please?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, in Indonesia, we have targeted in 2025, we have to reduce energy consumptions as many as 17% with the baseline in 2015. And then the energy efficiency becomes also the strategy to reduce the energy demand for net zero emissions. And in our country, we already more focused in industry. We have mandated industry with huge intensive energy, 6,000 ton oil equivalent per year. They have to report the energy use annually to government, and then they also have to utilize the energy using energy management concept. And then we will reduce the mandatory from 6,000 becoming under, and then also has some diversification for the energy management, not only for industry, but also for building, and then for transportations. And then what is the homework, the large homework for our country is to shift the utilizations of the transportation private car into the electrification using the EV, because the transportation's demand, the energy demand is the largest, and then it's require a huge effort to shift the energy use from the transportation sector. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sari. That I think agrees with what Lee was showing in one of her slides about the cost of different measures and how the transportation side was quite a high cost one. So that matches with what you're saying and you're experiencing in Indonesia. Is there anybody from Philippines who wants to give us a quick overview of how energy efficiency is situated in the Philippine context? Okay, we have one hand raised, Mali Letretro. Could somebody unmute? Thank you.
Yes, good morning. Our government passed the government efficiency management program. That means it's reducing the energy efficiency by 7%. And they have outlined some of the measures, example, changing air conditioners to inverters, using LED lights, etc. So for all, and it's all government agencies, from government corporations, even state universities and colleges, and all government entities. So we are required to reduce our energy efficiencies, and some of our government offices are also into solar roofing for in order to reduce energy consumption. That's all, sir.
Ms. Letrero, thank you very much.
Looks like we have one more hand up.
Hi, Bello.
Okay, good morning, Tarek and Lee. So in addition to, as Ms. Letrero mentioned, in the Philippines, in 2019, there was a new law. It was called the Energy Efficiency and Conservation Act. So the seeds of this law actually were the government energy management program, as mentioned by Ms. Letrero. But in this new law in 2019, it covers everything, not just the government agencies. So this law covers buildings, transportation, all aspects of energy usage. Like, for example, establishments are classified into type 1 and type 2, and there is an annual reporting of energy performance. Establishments are also encouraged to implement something like ISO 50001 type of energy management, not necessarily ISO 50001, but because it can be expensive to implement also, but similar energy management systems. So this is like in the laws that we see in our country, this is something like one of those that we have the whole of government approach, because even the academe are involved. The Department of Science and Technology are involved as stipulated in the law. Like in the academe, eventually the Philippines will have a certification for certified energy managers and certified energy conservation officers. So in order that eventually there will be full implementation of the law. I think right now, yeah, that also includes labeling as mentioned in the chat box. And the problem is because of the pandemic, the implementation was somewhat hindered, but hopefully as things go back to normal, this Energy Efficiency and Conservation Act will be fully implemented for the country.
Thanks very much, Bello. Sounds like there's quite a lot going on in Philippines and the other countries as well. Lee, shall I pass back to you?
Yeah, that sounds good. Yeah, thank you all for that overview of the areas that you're aware of in your current country. It sounds like there is a fair bit of focus on industry, which makes sense as a sector to target. And it sounds like there are these emerging or these ongoing targets to achieve improvements in energy efficiency, which I guess could be that, you know, some recognition that energy efficiency is often one of those areas where it can make sense financially as well as environmentally to try to get some of these improvements. So it can be a good area to target in many of these initial strategies. So I'll just pause and see if anyone had any broader questions, and if not, we'll continue with the next set of slides on policy options. We'll continue with the slides then. There is another pause for questions in chat fairly shortly. So as an overview, and most of these slides are discussing more the residential side, but I should say that all of these sort of categories of policy are they broadly apply to industry as well. So there's the three broad categories that we went over at the start, that policies to target energy efficiency. They can sort of fall into these regulatory, financial, or informational categories. So regulatory would be things like legally enforcing a minimum standard of energy efficiency for buildings or products. That could include things used in industry. The financial could include grants or loans to reduce the price of energy efficient options for households or industries that wanted to adopt those. And energy labeling schemes, again, they can apply to products, buildings, are to enable people to better understand the differences in energy use of different products so that they can make a more informed decision in their purchases. And so there's a lot of text in the table I put up there. It's from an article, but it gives a slightly more detailed breakdown of these different types of policies. And some of the categories that have been used to try to encourage energy efficiency. And so generally these strategies work. There's been also some concerns that about things like the rebound effect, where improvements in energy efficiency people will sometimes then use more energy because they're able to use it more cheaply. But in general, there's a trend of these policies to increase energy efficiency being effective. So things like regulated minimum standards do tend to improve the building stock over time, although the energy use doesn't always drop quite as much as expected. Financial measures can be useful in increasing the purchase of energy efficient goods, although not all of the programs have been as successful as hoped. And providing that additional information in the form of energy labeling schemes, which a lot of you said you're aware of operating in your countries. Those labeling schemes do tend to increase the value that consumers perceive in goods. So consumers generally do value energy efficiency in, say, purchasing a fridge or an air conditioner. And so providing those labels can be a way to let people see that a product has something that they value. And so this is an example from the EU of improvements in building codes reducing consumption over time. So they did find when they tested that the buildings built after these improved construction codes had lower energy use. They've been in the EU trying to strengthen these residential building code requirements over time with quite a complex series of changes and quite a bit of latitude for the different member countries to do things that work for them. And they have generally seen the energy use intensity, so the amount of energy used to achieve the same thing in the building, has declined over time. And particularly the graph that is shown there, they corrected for increases to income and other factors that have changed over time. So people do tend to use more energy to achieve more comfort, to get more of those services that energy provides. When people's income increases, they do tend to use more energy to access more of those services. So having these sort of measures to try to create infrastructure that allows access to those services without as much energy use can be very beneficial to try to control increases in energy use as material conditions improve. And again, possibly the text on the slides is more of use for reference after the lecture. Some of these tables from the academic papers. This is from one that was looking at financial instruments. So sometimes they found there were some concerns that when some of these policies, the grants and loans, particularly the grants, I think, were implemented, people with less ability to pay to go out and buy a more efficient fridge were bearing more of the cost of supporting that policy for others, but weren't as able to benefit from it. And in at least one of the cases, they actually saw, I think it was fridges in the US, they did see the price of the appliances somehow increased after they'd offered a subsidy. But also in several of these cases, they did find that there had been decreases in energy consumption following the implementation of these financial policies to support energy efficiency. And so that sort of series of tables in there, it gives an indication the pluses are ones where it was effective. And the negatives were ones where it was not so effective. So it depends a lot on the design of the individual policies in these spaces, the type of effect that it has. And this one is an overview of the value of energy labels. They had less mixed results here. They generally found that the more energy efficiency projects were much more valued by consumers. So that by being able to make the energy efficiency visible through these kinds of schemes, it would be expected to have an effect on the types of things that people were seeking out in their product purchases. And to give a little bit more of an overview, again, this one just looked at the informational and the regulatory instruments, not any of the financial ones. But it looked across several countries, not just European ones, but worldwide, to compare these policies to support energy efficiency, such as standard labeling. You can see, so there's quite a bit of variation in the economic cost effectiveness of the energy reductions. But in general, most of the different policies they looked at were working, although there were some of these cases where it was less effective. And just briefly coming back to what I was mentioning earlier about the existing building stock, it's something that no one really has yet come up with a good solution for making mass improvements to the efficiency of existing buildings. I think you could extend this to any large built infrastructure, including industrial. Things like minimum standards for energy efficiency can prevent new building stock from adding to the issue. But in terms of updating existing building stock, once it's been built, once the building or the industry is constructed, it can be much more expensive to make the upgrades. Perhaps less so in some industrial processes where you could replace components or improve parts. But things where you need to replace the building itself can be expensive. And it's something that most countries are still grappling with, is when there is a large amount of existing building stock that's not energy efficient, and it could be doing a much better job of providing affordable comfort to people living in the buildings, for example. How do you fix that problem? Do you try to pass mandates? Do you try to do financial measures? It's largely at the moment left to private market and mechanisms such as finance, information, and subsidy. But these all have sort of limited efficacy, limited ability to get that change. In particular, buildings occupied by renters can face particular challenges. So if you're living in the house that you own, it can be very worthwhile to improve the insulation, say, or to get a more efficient heater. It will be a high upfront cost, but it will have more comfort for the building, and you would have lower energy bills over time. But when it's a building that you're renting, you're reliant on the person who owns the building to provide those upgrades, but they themselves don't get the benefits of comfort and lower bills. So that's very much a current issue. And just summarizing that again, a very recent overview of this issue they evaluated existing policies for energy efficiency in buildings, but it was suggested that there's no single policy alone that can achieve a substantial transformation of this existing building stock and significantly reduce energy consumption. So they were looking at, it's another list, very similar to the ones you've seen before, of the different types of regulatory measures like building codes, energy performance for appliance and equipment, through to information and awareness, things like energy audits and labeling schemes. So this is the second pause for the Q&A. Feel free to ask me to go back to any of those slides and go through them in a bit more detail, where there was, if you didn't have as much of a chance as you wanted to look at any of the information on them. But the sort of prompt for this question and answer break is to think about the energy efficiency policies currently used in your countries, and why do you think those are the strategies that are being used at the moment? And sort of to tie it in a little bit to our last question and answer session, I did hear the use of targets, and that there was some, but not quite so much about the policies being used to work towards these targets. Although there were the loans in the Philippines, for example, but some of the specific instruments the specific policies being used to work towards those targets would be interesting to add to the table. And of course, your thoughts on the reasons that those might have been chosen.
Lee, will you be typing the answers into the table as we go? Is that?
Yes, I will actually have to change the view of it to be able to do that. There we go.
Yeah.
That should work.
Okay, so we did hear from the overviews from the 3 countries about labeling being used, and as you mentioned, benchmarks and targets, and those economic incentives like those loans or those funds that you mentioned in the Philippines. Is there any others that from the 3 countries that we see being used? Let's focus first on listing the policies, and then we can maybe explain a little bit, have a bit of a discussion about why they were selected in your country. Any others that we can see in Vietnam, Philippines, or Indonesia? You can type it into the chat box or just raise your hands and we can unmute you at the same time. Perhaps there was a comment about the 7 circulars being used in Vietnam. So if anyone wants to, in the chat box there, if anyone wants to add more on that part. There's a law on energy efficiency. So I guess that's a regulatory measure in Vietnam that was mentioned.
Is that for products categories? Is it sort of a minimum standard, or is it a disclosure law? If this is overly specific, then also we could have a discussion about at a more of an overview level.
Okay, so a comment. So there is an interest to understand what the Australian government is doing to incentivize energy efficiency efforts in households or for residential customers.
I can certainly talk quite a bit about that, actually, if that's an area of interest. Do we want to give some other questions a chance to come in, or shall I start on that one?
Well, maybe good to answer that one while we get some more existing policies and people have a chance to think of the reasons why those policies were chosen in the 3 countries. So
Yeah, so the Australian government and measures to increase energy efficiency in households, it is something that's been evolving over time. So I think it was around 2004 that the minimum energy standards for new builds were first introduced. There's an Energy Star rating system or an energy rating system. I don't think they have stars. For households in across Australia. So they introduced around 2004, I think it was, that all buildings had to be minimum 5 stars, which is tied to a particular level of energy use per square meter. And then they increased that requirement a couple years later to a 6-star minimum, so a smaller amount of energy use per square meter. They're looking at increases on that again. But again, there's a very large amount of existing building stock that was not subject to those minimum requirements and remains much less energy efficient than those buildings built after 2004. Part of the efforts in this space are to understand the scope of the energy efficiency problem, I guess, with the existing building stock, because, well, the newer ones were required to evaluate that at construction, the older ones weren't, which makes it much less visible. And there's also the factor that the states within Australia have a lot of power to set their own rules in these areas. And so there's some variation there. The Australian Capital Territory, where Canberra, which is effectively Canberra, where the ANU is based, was a bit of a front runner there. So actually farther back, around 1995 or 1997, they'd implemented again, a minimum energy standard for new residential construction. And they're also currently the only state in Australia that has a disclosure requirement So if you're putting your house up for sale or for rent, you need to disclose that energy efficiency rating so that people have more information to make their choices. And this is, and there is actually a lot currently going on in that space to try to get more cohesion in terms of disclosure at the national level, but a lot of this is decisions by the states. So there's actually expected to be some changes in this space over the next couple of years to try to strengthen the visibility of these energy efficiency ratings and to increase pressures, I guess, to upgrade existing buildings, particularly rentals, and exploration of associated financial support potentially around this as well. So sort of a combination of regulation, information, and financial policy mechanisms to achieve that goal, all of which are changing over the decades.
Thanks, Lee. And there's a follow-up question related to Australia's neighbours system, the energy efficiency standards. Do you think it's been effective in Australia, and is it a good model for other countries to emulate?
Neighbours, is it maybe the NATERS system, which is the building energy rating one? I'm not familiar with the neighbours system.
I think it is the one about efficiency in buildings.
Yeah, and I think there's a commercial building one as well that has a name that's probably a little bit different to the residential one. So I'll answer if it's those ones. I think it's a good starting place. The Australian energy efficiency standards are still considered not as strong compared to places like the EU and the US. So Australia is looking overseas for how to improve these rating systems and these legislative requirements in an ongoing process. However, it has done something. It has improved the situation in Australia over the case of not having any of these standards, and it's begun to provide, data for improvement and a starting place for improvement. So I think each country sort of needs to develop to some extent based on their own needs. But certainly I think the Australian one, it can be a good place to look as a starting point. Australia is also looking at the EU one as a model. So it's sort of a lot of learning going on in various directions.
Yep. Yeah, so there was a clarification from colleagues at Energy Lab Cambodia who said that NATERS is the domestic one and neighbours is the commercial. Okay, so we've got a few more comments filling out your table there, Lee. So there's more descriptions of loans that are provided for like new kind of public and private sector to harness new technologies. I don't know if that goes under the same headings. There's also the energy efficiency law. There seems to be a law in the Philippines as well for this kind of thing. And there's fiscal incentives also provided by BOI, which is about energy, project level energy savings and setting targets for projects. Household labeling of energy appliances was mentioned again. I think we've got that one already. And also, I think there's a decision in Vietnam looking at energy labeling for vehicles. Is that, am I understanding that one right? Decision number 51 in the comment box there. Okay. So what we now have to just quickly, I mean, we don't want to spend too much time on this, colleagues, but the reasons why these are being chosen. So maybe, Lee, what are some of the typical reasons that people adopt energy efficiency measures? We've heard from people that emissions reductions is one.
Yes, I haven't explained the reasons for choices prompt quite as well. So I guess we're operating on the assumption that the driving reason for putting in place the energy efficiency policy would be a low cost improvement or ways to improve things like environmental outcomes, comfort, cost effectiveness. But in terms of choosing, say, to use a loan instead of a regulator, instead of a mandate, or to use a loan alongside a mandate, I would think there would be things like, for example, the need to address upfront capital costs as a barrier, or to use labeling. Actually, it would be interesting to understand whether the labeling is voluntary or mandatory, because voluntary tends to be easier to implement, but mandatory, of course, has a wider reach. So maybe we can have more of a free-form discussion on that instead of filling in the table, I think. But I guess what I was hoping people might be able to talk about is, what do you think are some of the, I guess, trade-offs being made, or particular barriers that are trying to be overcome by putting in place these policies? Why might one be chosen over another, or a couple chosen to work together?
Okay, do we have any colleagues who have thoughts on this? About why our countries are taking certain paths, and what's the trade-off there in the decision between taking a regulatory or an incentive or different kinds of approaches? Not an easy question to answer.
And there's certainly no right answers, or I'm sure there's, it's a very multifaceted question. But I think it can be an interesting one to think about, and thinking about what kinds of directions might be useful to go next. Like in that Australian case I was talking about, there's some of the reasons for trying to improve the energy efficiency disclosures for buildings are to increase visibility of information for consumers and try to access some more market pressure via that, for example.
Mm-hmm. There's a question that's come in about the in Vietnam, the energy efficiency decision. So because that's been in place for about 10 years, has there been any evaluation in Vietnam about how effective it is? So that's an interesting one. If there's any Vietnamese colleagues who have thoughts on that as well, or comments on that.
That is an interesting one. I didn't see any when I was looking, but I may not have as much visibility as people who live in Vietnam of those kinds of things. It can be very challenging, actually, to evaluate the effects of these laws and policies, particularly if it's challenging to understand what the situation was before the law was implemented. So, for example, especially if it's something like introducing mandatory labeling, after you've introduced that, you can hopefully get a data set of energy efficiency information contained in those labels, but before it's introduced, it can be very challenging to know what the situation is, and it can make it challenging to compare a before and after effectiveness. I think these challenges of data to make comparisons are particularly prevalent in places that historically maybe haven't had as much data collection in this area, and there's still serious barriers in places like Australia that have been, doing this for a while.
There's a comment that's come in as well about from the Philippines context. So loans for renewable energy projects are supported and also backed by incentives. If in a larger scale, because the target is to increase the kind of the proportion of renewable energy sources in the mix. there are also incentives or initiatives in which renewable energy investments are partnered between government and private sector, with funding coming from funding agencies apart from loan. So is that, if I understand that correctly, the kind of the incentive, the financial incentive one, is often one that's used where private sector is being encouraged to do something?
Yeah, you'll often hear policies sort of talked about in terms of carrot or stick, with the carrot, the appealing option being, we'll make it cheaper for you to do this thing, and the regulation being the stick. You know, you have to do this thing or there's a bad consequence. So yes, that would be to increase the appeal.
Okay, and we definitely have some colleagues who are heavily involved in this energy efficiency space in their country. So there's some results being shared from Vietnam about the performance of the VNE project. So we're looking at energy savings of between 3 and 6%, of 5.6%. There's a comment there that with the above efforts, by 2014, energy consumption, especially electricity consumption, has decreased equivalent to 7.3 million tons of CO2 compared to the business as usual case. So there are efforts to kind of track and measure that as well.
Yeah. No, thank you for that. That's sorry, there's a lot of text in the chat box to catch up with. Yeah, no, that's really encouraging to know that there is the tracking underway, that there have been comparisons of the savings, and that it sounds like it is an effective program. Yes, request. Yeah, okay. So I think that is a good place to go back to the next section of the lecture, which I think we've jumped ahead to some of it, I think, in the discussion, and then we'll have another Q&A point after this. So thinking about what situations each tool can be good for, this is a bit of a simplification. Of course, there's a lot of complexity in, well, how do you put the tools together, and what other constraints are you facing to choosing which of the tools are best. So things like voluntary standards can tend to have lower costs to implement, but they might have less certain environmental benefits. Mandatory standards can, you have more certainty about the environmental benefit you're getting, but it can be very costly potentially to industries and households to meet the new energy efficiency standards. So there tends to be quite a bit of caution used in deciding when to set those mandatory standards and what level they should be set at. And yeah, so having the minimum required standards, if you don't have the sufficient underlying data to start getting an understanding of what are the costs to implement that, then there can be some concerns there. In terms of financial measures, it can be expensive to provide things like the loans and subsidies, but you also have the benefit with those that the people who then choose to take, or people or businesses who choose to take that up and make the improvements, are the ones who expect to be able to get some benefits, as well as improving their energy efficiency. So if you don't sort of have that better idea of what would be the cost of a minimum standard, it might be the case that it's better to leave more of that freedom for, well, who's going to volunteer to go first, taking advantage of those subsidies, or to implement both at once, one to offset the other. Information measures like the minimum, like the labeling, some of them, sometimes they're more effective than others, but they're relatively cheap to implement, and can begin to build a database for future improvements, as well as providing that information for decisions in the near term by consumers and other parties. So most places use all of these in various combinations across different sectors. So there has been some work in the academic literature looking at how do you set these minimum standards in a place where it can be challenging to get the data baseline. And so that was by the authors was Shi, who's cited here. And that was, I believe, one of the readings that was put on the Moodle, if anyone wants to look at it later. And so they essentially experimented with, or they ran a test case of a way to collect information, a relatively small amount of information to try to understand where to set a minimum energy standard baseline. And so this was from the perspective of when you are setting these minimum energy performance standards, places like Australia have tended to run extensive modeling on existing data to find a level of policy that supports energy goals without too much burden on consumers and on the country to support that. But it can be challenging to do in places that don't have a lot of resources for testing and analysis or don't have a lot of historical data to work with. And so what she did in this paper was developed an assessment method looking at air conditioners, and it has a lower data burden using a relatively small consumer survey to understand preferences there, and also collecting information from manufacturers on available technologies. So one of the things that they noted was that actually, although the market, they think they were looking at Brunei, didn't have minimum efficiency standards at the moment and had fairly inefficient air conditioners, it didn't seem like it would be challenging for the companies providing the air conditioners to provide more efficient ones because they were already providing the more efficient models for other places like China and could relatively easily scale up manufacturing. I think even that quite simplified example gives a bit of an idea of the number of dimensions that a model would need to include to understand the cost impacts. And so that's sort of an interesting case in the need to think about the sort of quite wide set of factors in if you are going to set a minimum performance standard or maybe increase a minimum performance standard, where do you start? Like, where's a safe starting place to move towards those goals without too much burden? And so this one again was looking at an existing energy information policy. They looked at the Philippines and Ghana to understand whether middle income countries in these households were changing their behavior or were basing their purchase decisions on the energy efficiency information provided in appliance labeling, again with air conditioners. And they, in this region as well, also found that consumers do care for energy efficiency. They did prefer, they were influenced by the presence of the energy efficiency labels. They did prefer the more efficient ones, but also the ones that had better cooling technology, which is very sensible. And that the energy rating had a bigger impact on choice than the price did. And also that people who were more concerned about the environment in the Philippines, they had an even higher value for the more energy efficient appliance. And so that's sort of a case, a more local case, in part of the effectiveness of some of these labeling strategies. And I did talk about this a little bit in my Australian housing example during the Q&A. This is a different country. This is looking at sort of the landscape in the UK of the landscape of policies for energy efficiency policy. And you can, and this is common to most countries, is that there will be sort of policies implemented and added to and changed and updated over time, so that it's this very complex ecosystem that emerges, and many of the components sort of stay or are updated, but not all of them. Some of them do cease. And so it tends to be something that increases in complexity over time, adding more and more of these tools to try to reach energy efficiency goals. including, for example, you can see they must have been trying to improve outcomes for renters there. That's something that's targeted at landlords. This looks like it was a larger act that was sort of influencing a wide set of things. Energy efficiency financing, trying to address upfront costs and things like that. So really a hybrid of sets of policies targeting specific sub-areas. And another example from the EU of standards tightening over time. In the EU, many member states have increased the minimum energy performance requirements over time. As I mentioned during the chat, this is also something Australia has been doing and is expected to continue to do in the future. And so they've been, probably Germany, France, Italy, Spain, you know, they started off with relatively high energy use per square meter, but they've been updating over time to strengthen the requirement of those minimum energy standards for gradual improvement for new builds. And you know, these are a lot of examples from the residential space, but this sort of general pattern can also you see it in appliance and product standards. For example, the US corporate average fuel economy standard for vehicle manufacturing has changed over time to increase the mile per gallon requirements for vehicle fuel efficiency. And one of the things that you often see with this policy development, which I also talked a bit about in the Australia cases, often there will be sort of experiments at the subnational level, like the ACT, Australian Capital Territory, being the first state in Australia to implement disclosure requirements, which may someday be scaled up by other states. And in the US, I believe it was historically, California has often been the first to test a policy about something like fuel economy. And then when that's effective, sometimes it will get taken up at the national level after it's been in the wild for a while. I spoke about this a bit already too, but in terms of housing stock, and you can apply this to anything, industries, appliances, it can be challenging to determine what to target for future change and where to set the target for future change without understanding the state of the existing infrastructure, the existing appliance or product stock. And it can be challenging to understand which strategies are most effective without these baselines as well. So having the mechanisms to collect information on things like building and industry and product energy efficiency can be pretty critical in supporting future efforts for improvement, like having enough information to know where to set a minimum energy standard, for example, or how big to make a loan. And sort of zooming out again a little bit, we're all aware that climate change is expected to increase the frequency and severity of extreme weather events, including heat waves. These events can, especially heat waves, can place very severe stress on electricity grids. So things like building energy efficiency or appliance energy efficiency can be useful to have in place in this context. Buildings that are able to stay within safe temperature ranges while using less energy will be something that's quite important to have in this new environment. So for example, if your building is quite well insulated and you were running the AC and then you had to turn it off, it would not heat up as quickly if it was well insulated and double glazed and had shading, compared to a building that had poor insulation. So you wouldn't need to be using as much energy to keep it cool, and you wouldn't be needing to use it as continuously for that purpose, to keep it within sort of a comfortable or at least a safe temperature range. And also looking ahead, there's a real concern about lock-in of infrastructure that's inefficient or uses a lot of energy. So especially in places where cities are growing or where things are being replaced, and there's a lot of new infrastructure being built. If more efficient infrastructure is built, then you're locking in fewer emissions from the future to keep those buildings running. It's much harder to change that when you're looking back and you've already got the buildings, you've already got transport systems, you've already got industry established. And so thinking about the timing of increasing some of these things, the timing of putting in place things like minimum standards can be quite important for thinking about ability to impact future emissions. This is a little bit more the third Q&A break for the session. Sort of a pause to think about constraints that you see to improving energy efficiency in your countries, and which of the things discussed today do you think might be useful to add or change, you know, compared to strategies already in place?
Great, thanks, Lee. So there's two questions there. If anyone wants to have a think about them and put your hand up or put a comment in the chat box, the constraints for energy efficiency in your country and which of these strategies might be useful for your country. It'd be really good to get the feedback from you all, because I know many of you are working in this space. Lee, while we're waiting, there is one question that's come in that's related to energy efficiency, and can somebody who's working on energy efficiency claim carbon credits in an ETS system?
I would probably need to double check this, but I would think no. So that's probably coming from the perspective of, you know, can you claim it as an avoided emission? Technically, it would be an avoided emission. I can't think of any examples where something like an energy efficiency upgrade, there's a real challenges in all sectors with establishing was something really an avoided emission. And when you have challenges establishing that, then assigning a carbon credit to it becomes challenging as well. So it's really an area that there's a lot of discussion about how to improve it. I'll stop there for the answer to that question. Yeah. But I would think it would be extremely challenging to do that. There may be attempts being made to do so, but establishing that it was an avoided emission, and the quantity of avoidance can be.
There's another comment that's come in, so it is in the chat box. I'll just read it out. It seems that energy efficiency as an energy transition enabler is not as clear to most people as renewable energy. So the question is about why is that the case? Is it because the benefits of energy efficiency in terms of avoided demand is more difficult to quantify? And if yes, how do you think we can improve on the measurement aspect of making energy efficiency more tangible? If measurement is not an issue or not the issue, what makes energy efficiency lag behind renewables when the topic of energy transition comes up?
It's interesting because this actually hasn't been my personal experience. I've always actually noticed that energy efficiency does tend to come up in a lot of discussions about transition. So I guess we actually need to add another question there of why are different people hearing different things on the importance in this space. I would also add, you know, energy efficiency alone isn't enough. You do also need renewable energy. And one of the very fundamental things here, I guess, is, well, if you can improve your energy efficiency, then you don't need to build as much renewable energy because your overall energy demand is lower, and this is a good thing. And you may also have some things like, well, you might have more flexibility in demand management and balancing your instantaneous supply and demand between things like solar and, well, if your fridge compressor doesn't need to kick in quite as often because it's more efficient fridge with better insulation, maybe you've got a little bit more wiggle room there, instantaneous generation. I don't have any numbers on that though, unfortunately. So yeah, I think there have been some measurements for energy efficiency, but the sort of rebound effect can come up where improving the energy efficiency, you get a lot of good things out of it, including comfort and affordability, as well as energy reductions. But separating out some of those benefits can be a little bit challenging because you might not reduce the energy use as much as expected because you've also gotten a bunch of other things out of your energy efficiency. I think it is important to have it come up more in conversations. I'm not actually sure why it wouldn't be, because in the conversations I've been aware of, things like the IPCC, for example, it does come up very early. But you know, it's a lot less visible to improve the insulation in your house compared to sticking some solar panels on your roof. So that can also play a part in it. And I'll actually say, as we're going through the questions this time, that we've got lots of time for them because there's only the summary really left. We've got more time for questions than I anticipated, actually. So we can take our time with these. And so yeah.
It's an interesting question and response there from Isabella about the perception of renewables and energy efficiency. Bella, I might come back to you a bit later if you collect your thoughts, and maybe we can explore that topic a bit more. But in the meantime, Lee, we did get some answers to your questions coming in on the chat. So I would encourage, if anyone who's put their answers into the chat who wants to actually talk to them, you'll probably do better justice to your comment than me kind of summarizing it. So please feel free to put your hand up, and we can also just pass to you to explain your comments further. But there was a comment about some of the limitations in Vietnam being about awareness of community and businesses, so limited awareness. For the business side, there was also a constraint in the lack of capital and limitations in the management of businesses in localities. And then there was also a comment that resources to implement and monitor energy savings and associated with the law are limited as well. So one was about the awareness, one was about kind of the investment, the capital for investment in the energy efficiency measures, and one was around how resources to monitor and effectively monitor savings made.
Yeah, I am able to take a look through the chat now also, so I do have that open. Yeah, that's a really good point about the limited resources to implement and monitor regulations, because it can be very resource intensive to ensure that once a mandate has been set, that it's actually being followed. And of course, if it's not being followed, it's not having the intended effect. So thank you for raising that one, as well as all the other points.
There was also that point raised there about a challenge being implementing, or constraint being implementing at the local level. That was sort of raised as well, Lee. And that was coming from Philippines, as well as the cost and availability of funds.
I see there's quite a bit in the chat as well.
Yeah, there's quite a few people are mentioning about the need for the skills and the system, both the skills and the system to establish baselines and to monitor for energy efficiency. So that's definitely a question that's come up. And there's also a question about, related about evaluation. And then also the dependency on the private initiatives. One constraint mentioned is too much dependence on private initiatives, specifically ESCOs, to spearhead industrial level energy efficiency implementation, and difficult to convince customers of these benefits.
Yeah, and that I'll start with that one and then go back to some of the others. I was recently having, you know, some conversations with people in this space. Even if you do have things like an energy audit and you hand it to an industry and say, these are all the things you could do to save money, sometimes they still won't make that change, even if it's sort of laid out. And it can be, I guess, a point where there's just a bit of inertia about actually making the changes. Some of the things that can be effective there are sort of more follow-up, or sort of providing someone who is able to sort of change, walk them through the steps of, this is what we recommended on paper, here's a person who can help you do it in practice, like start making phone calls, start ordering things, and having that sort of, I guess, barrier removed onto what's next after we know where to reduce things can be quite effective. So that's sort of within the larger idea in literature, I guess, and other studies, that providing information alone on things like energy efficiency often isn't enough to prompt change. Even if there's information education that something will be beneficial, and people often still won't do it. But if it's coming from someone that they trust or respect, or if it's tied to something more tangible where they can, for example, see immediate changes in energy use as a result of doing the laundry with cold water. If they had a smart meter, for example, that can be something that prompts change. So it is something that can take, I guess, quite a bit of, follow-up strategies to get some of the movement there.
Yeah. So the information alone is not enough to often make the to hit the targets that you want in energy efficiency, but it's the first step in that process.
Yeah, it often isn't enough alone. Although, I mean, as I was talking about earlier with the energy labels, when people are, say, making a decision to buy a new appliance, that's a point where they do really need that information. So it's very context dependent.
Yep.
People do sort of have a tendency to discount things that are future costs as well. So maybe not really give a full account of cheaper running costs for an energy efficient appliance, even though they do, as a general trend, value them more. So all of those things are complexities feeding into actually getting as much movement as there's potential for in this space.
Yeah.
And in terms of that other set of points about the capacity to set up the tracking of the data, I think that's one of the biggest challenges really is who tracks it, who collects it, do you have time, do you have people, where does it live, who can access it, how do you deal with privacy concerns? And these are all incredibly, I don't know if I can give you local advice because you know so much more about your local context than I do, and which of those concerns are the biggest ones for you and what constraints there are to addressing them. But I think it's something that Australia also is grappling with. So it's even places that you would think might have an advantage resource-wise, that they're very challenging issues, but they also very much can limit the amount or limit the size of progress made in the area. So I think they're really important issues to think about how to move forwards on.
On that point, there is an interesting comment in the chat box, Lee, about like kind of synchronizing the policy development, or like having kind of complementary policies. So there was comment from a colleague in Vietnam that some of the technical based EE regulations are available, but they're not backed or matched with the kind of the financial based policies that might incentivize or promote the energy efficiency. So that kind of cohesion between the different kinds of policy instruments is something that it seems to be a constraint in the Vietnam context. I don't know if you have any thoughts there from EU example or Australian example where that's been achieved well or has not been achieved well as well.
I guess I wonder if that is, if it's a mandate or if it's a voluntary. It might help to hear more about the question, because if it's a mandate to meet a certain level of energy efficiency, maybe it's a question of enforcement for people who aren't meeting that. Because if it is a mandate, then the idea is that people meet it even if it's expensive. So financial support should reduce the burden for them, but it should still be met if it's a mandate, unless the other aspect is not in place. So I'm having a little bit of trouble interpreting quite where I can contribute there.
Okay, if anyone from Vietnam, Mr. Kung or anyone else from Vietnam who wants to clarify a little bit about this, the technical based regulations that are in place and what's actually required in them would be very useful. In the meantime, we have another comment from Philippines. So aside from the fiscal incentives, any thoughts on how we can encourage more people to adopt energy efficiency measures? And so we can successfully implement the new energy efficiency, or the energy efficiency and conservation law at the wider scale.
Yeah, I think the visibility is important. Things like the labeling, so that when you tell people to go and choose something more efficient, then they can tell which thing it is. There are things like the minimum standards, but I'll assume from the framing of the question that that's sort of a bit of a prohibitive burden. I think in addition to making fiscal incentives available, there can be a bit of a need to ease the path for people to be aware of the things like loans and subsidies and how to access them and use them to make upgrades to their own homes. And so that sort of goes back a bit to what we were talking about earlier, where the person that provides the information can make a difference in terms of whether a change is made or not. Is it a trusted party? Is it a community leader? And things like that. So I guess those are fairly low cost additions that I focused on there. Or maybe the question was more that if you don't have the ability to provide fiscal incentives, how can you encourage the energy efficiency, which I would still say the very sort of first point is the visibility through something like labeling. If there isn't a capacity to put in place things like regulations and fiscal measures.
I have a question, Lee, about how things are done in Australia. The efforts to kind of promote energy efficiency in Australia, are they being driven by kind of a government agenda to, let's say, reduce emissions or to make the electricity system more, balance supply and demand better? Or are they driven by kind of households and energy consumers who are looking to kind of save money on their electricity bills? What's the, or both? What's the relative importance of those different kinds of drivers, like governments and consumers in the Australian context?
That's an interesting question to explore on a more, I guess, quantitative side at some point in research. My impression from being involved in the space, there's a lot of awareness in the government side and push to improve for things like the climate measures, but also for things like affordability of energy is a big one, and comfort. So some of the things that I'm aware of, because I do research in this area, includes things like trying to improve the situation for renters and trying to improve the situation for low-income households who otherwise can, they often end up in the buildings that are the most expensive to keep comfortable, even though they're the group that has the least ability to spend more on their electricity bills. And so that's a problem that I think governments at the federal and the state levels are aware of and are trying to address through policy. I have less of an overview of the consumer side, but I would think people often are quite aware of energy efficiency, but also in terms of, you know, will it benefit them if there isn't a subsidy or a mandate? Also things like if it's the landlord who owns the rental, do they benefit by improving the energy efficiency? They might not. So how do you change that equation? Or do you just put in place a mandate and at least then it's level playing field? And so you don't have the case where one landlord says, well, if I improve the energy efficiency, then I've spent more, but my neighbor hasn't, and we're both getting the same rent.
Yep. Yeah, it's very interesting for the Philippines, Vietnam, and Indonesia, because they are all in processes of a growing consumer voice in their countries and moving to more market-based approaches to things. So, okay. I'm trying to keep up with all the questions in the chat here, so apologies if I'm missing people. But yeah, again, an offer, if anybody wants to raise their hand and ask directly, it's much better to hear from you in person. So there's some constraints here mentioned, again, from the Vietnam context. So upgrade and renew equipment and technology for energy production and use, improve the efficiency and save energy. So these are some of the potential things that could be employed, I guess, or that recommendations to employ: reduce pollution and awareness raising. Okay. One other comments come through for Isabello about willing to explore a little more on ESCO challenges, to talk a bit more about the ESCO challenges in the Philippines. The comment is made that the Philippines is ahead of most countries in terms of ESCOs, and yet the comment was also made that it's difficult to convince potential industrial customers to adopt EE measures. So for example, companies don't trust the baseline for the revenue sharing model, any solutions for this issue, the need for an independent body to verify revenue sharing. Isabella, it's a comment for you. If you want to, please put your hand up and we can unmute you to comment. Otherwise, yeah, would you like to comment, Isabella? A bit more about ESCOs?
Yeah, thanks, Tarek, because we have, in the Philippines, we have Department of Energy accredited ESCOs, but yeah, that is just my observation, that there is not much, like, I cannot see much activity in terms of reports of ESCOs on the aspect of energy efficiency, like what you've mentioned, the difficulty of quantification and revenue sharing model. There are financial incentives that ESCOs are the ones authorized to apply for, but yeah, it's difficult. It has been mentioned a while that a lot of enterprises do energy audits, but then after the energy audit, they don't really do much on the recommendations. So, I think fairly Lee has covered, and you have also added in terms of the points that I have raised in the discussion. Thank you, Tarek.
Thanks, Bello.
I don't know if everyone's getting the siren on my end. Yeah, I think the issue of the idea of independent bodies to verify information that can be really valuable, where there's a question of, you know, it's very important to ensure that the information you're acting on is accurate, and if it's been provided by someone who maybe has a vested interest in the information, there might be less trust of that information than if it came from a completely independent party who's they don't have any vested interest in any way in the quantity of that. So that's through that sort of feeds into things like certification and verification processes through things like ISO standards. You again run into that takes time and money and resources to implement. But if there is a question of credibility and information, that I agree that could be a real barrier to change, because you don't know what you're working from. So also you'll see I have put up sort of the last discussion prompt really. I can do a summary if useful. I think there were only sort of the same set of points we've covered through the lecture, or the three core types of policy instruments, and the need and complexity around tailoring them for local use. I think we've probably been covering a lot of this already, but just in the last couple minutes of the session before we hand back to Tom for close. Were there any questions that you had at the beginning of the session that you feel like you still don't know the answers to, or do you now have new questions, and what are they? But I think it's been a really interesting discussion in the chat. So I'm glad we did have time to go over some of these, I guess, on the ground issues and that I wouldn't necessarily have thought to discuss the audit implication in the slides. But it seems like that was an issue that probably a lot of people had questions about.
Any comments from anyone? While we're waiting, we see if anyone wants to put their hand up, because it would be great to hear from somebody about this. Just to Lee, Mr. Kung has clarified his comment about the Vietnam ESCO system. So he said that it mandates all designated energy consumers, that is the big energy consumers, they've been identified, that they have to conduct an energy audit and report regularly. And they also need to propose their energy efficiency measures, but it's not required to invest on replacing the equipment. And so there's no penalty. So they've got the requirements to kind of audit and to monitor and to identify solutions, but not to invest in them.
Yeah, that makes much, thank you for clarifying that. That's really interesting as a policy design, and it's meeting that good feature of providing information, but without that mandate to actually get to a change in situation. It does remind me actually of a question that I had for all of you, which maybe is a good place to close if there weren't any of those responses to the prompt, which is, I was talking about how in Australia and places like the EU and other countries, there's been this iterative change over time with things increasing in stringency, mandates getting stronger, and that sort of change over time. Is that something that you feel is happening in your countries, or that you would see happening? For example, to use this Vietnam comment from Mr. Kong, do you think that in the future they might use this information base to start requiring that the investments actually occur? Is that something that might be discussed in future policy rollout once this information base has sort of been collected by the initial policy to support future updates?
Yeah, good question. If Mr. Kung or anybody else wants to answer that on the Vietnamese side, is this?
He says yes. That's good.
Oh, great. Okay. So it's sort of a phased approach to implementation in Vietnam. First is getting that kind of monitoring and verification in place, and then the next step will be to kind of ease the big users into acting on it.
And I think in general, this is a really sensible and practical approach, actually. Like you can't necessarily come in with, you don't have this information at this very high level of mandate if you don't know where to set it. But by sort of ratcheting it up over time, you can build the information base to make those changes. It's just a question with things like climate change of, well, we don't have infinite time. And so it's good to the extent possible to look at other places that are a bit farther ahead and see, well, where are the points that we could move faster.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I think we are. So there is a lot of interest around energy efficiency and ESCOs.
Yeah,
That's come out from Philippines, from Vietnam. Definitely, I think something for us to think about as a group, because we are lucky that we've got countries with different types of ESCOs and a different stage of deployment of ESCOs. So it's definitely something, I think, an area for sharing between us about how we can bring energy efficiency measures into these.
I think so. I don't know if this has come up in Australia. I think California several decades ago had something like that, where they required the electric utilities to be involved in improving energy efficiency. So yeah. I could try to find a reference for that if it's useful, but I think it may be such a different case that it's actually more useful to talk within sort of the participants here.
Yeah, would be great to put it on Moodle, and also to have that discussion and sharing. You know, we've got, as we said, a lot of people here have some deep experience on energy efficiency in the countries, and to take that discussion into the Moodle chat and to share between Vietnam and Philippines and Indonesia some of these things that are being applied and tried would be great.
Well, thanks everyone for great discussion. I feel like I learned a large amount here too. I hope the participants did. I see a call for an ESCO session. I think maybe it's time to hand to Tommy for the close, but thank you all. I'll stop.
Thanks a lot, Lee and Tarek, and thanks everyone for very active participation. And I found that, yeah, I wish we have another session on this topic, and as someone suggested, another session on ESCO. Energy efficiency relatively more developed in terms of regulations than other topics that we've discussed so far, and certainly there's still more work on complementing and completing the content as well as the enforcement of the regulations. So please do feel free to go to Moodle site, put up any thoughts, any experience, lessons you want to share with each other. And I'm sure that Lee and others would be happy to continue a discussion there. So thanks everyone for active participation today. Next week, next session in 2 weeks' time, we'll switch to Thursday, right? Not Wednesday. We'll switch to Thursday to avoid public holiday. At the same time, but Thursday in 2 weeks' time, see you again on another interesting topic about trade related and renewable energy. And then we'll have 2 more sessions on more social aspects of the energy transition. So thanks and have a great rest of the day, and see you again soon.